So today we're going to talk about the economic development of nations. Now, the reason why we need to talk about this has to do with if a business wants to expand, how does it perceive a country? Should it perceive it as a potential production center, or does it perceive the country as a potential market? So we're going to spend time to talk about this. Let's take a look of what I have prepared. Now, in general, countries can be categorized based on the economic development. If you look at this company, you're probably familiar with it. It's a global provider of IT services, an Indian company. One of the strengths has to do with their brain power, meaning that they have hired a lot of people, a lot of very talented people that make them so successful. Now, we may classify or categorize countries based on their economic development. The countries that are relatively poor, relatively underdeveloped, we call them developing countries. For example, some countries in Africa, they are considered to be developing countries. Those countries tend to be poor, and also their, for example, infrastructure, their education system may not be as well developed. And then we have a second category, NIC, newly industrialized countries, including, for example, a number of Asian countries. Now, both the developing countries and the newly industrialized countries are potential providers of cheap labor and natural resources. In other words, even though a company may not expect people in those two types of countries to be buying their products. However, the company can still make use of the cheap labor and or the natural resources available in those two types of countries. And then we have emerging markets, which are actually very interesting because those emerging markets, they do not only provide cheaper labor and natural resources, but they themselves are potential markets for the various products and services. As a company, you look at those countries not only as the providers of labor and resources, but also potential consumers. Examples are Brazil, Russia, India, China, etc., etc. Last but not least, we have the developed countries. Canada, United States, Australia, Britain, Germany, France, Japan. These countries have a very large middle class. and the income is relatively high. For the developed countries, you do not expect labor to be cheap. Natural resources may still be available. For developed countries, because of the large middle class, they are also very good markets for a lot of products. Now, so far, I wonder if there's any question.
No, Professor.
Okay, good. Feel free to let me know if there's anything not clear to you. Now, the developing countries has a lower average standard of living. In addition to have smaller economies, developing countries tend to be not as well established regarding the legal system. Education level of people may not be that high, and we are also talking about lower literacy rates, meaning people who can read, the percentage may not be very high. Life expectancies tend to be short and weaker human rights protections than developed countries. However, as said, raw materials, natural resources, and cheap labor can be both provided. We do not expect demand of expensive goods and services. So usually companies focus a lot on the cheap labor and the raw materials. Newly industrialized countries, they are more developed compared to the developing countries. We're talking about a country whose national economy has transitioned from being primarily based in agriculture to being primarily based in goods producing industries, such as manufacturing, construction, mining. NIC also trades more with other countries and has a high standard of living compared to the developing countries. Raw materials can still be provided. Labor is still relatively cheap compared to, for example, emerging markets and developed countries. Demand of expensive goods and services can still be low because the middle class is not large enough. The next stage is what we call emerging markets. Now, those countries have already gone through the developing stage and also have gone beyond the newly industrialized stage. Because of that, they have a growing middle class and have also become new markets. They have provided cheap labor and or natural resources, which help to reduce production costs of goods and services, but the labor cost in particular tends to be higher than the developing countries and the newly industrialized countries. And then we have so-called the developed countries. The wealthy nations produce high-value products and services. Demand of expensive goods and services can be high. On the other hand, you don't expect some manufacturing to be conducted in developed countries. For example, clothes, right? It's not easy for you to find the made in Canada shirt or made in United States t-shirt because they tend to be more expensive to produce such kind of products. So most of those, what we call the low-skilled products, now tend to be produced in developing countries, newly industrialized countries, or emerging markets, but not in developed countries. I wonder if there's any question.
No, sir.
Okay, good. Now, how do we measure the economic development of a country? Now, a very common way to do it is to make use of an indicator. It's called GDP. GNP is another one, but GDP is more commonly used. When we talk about GDP or GNP, it's not only to measure the productivity of a country, but it's also used to measure the income of a country. This is why it is the case, because how much income you have is determined by the productivity. For example, when I say that my income is $80,000 per year, basically what I'm saying is that my productivity is also $80,000, and my productivity determines my income. So productivity and income are basically the two faces of the same coin. Now, GNP or GDP is often used to measure the productivity and income growth of a country. Now, the difference is about the middle word. GNP, the middle word is national, meaning that it has to do with nationality. When we talk about GNP, is to measure the value of all the goods and services produced by a national economy within a given period of time, regardless of production location. Now, what does it mean? For example, when I want to measure the GNP of Canada, I'm talking about the value of all the goods and services produced by Canadians or Canadian companies, but the location does not matter. In other words, if a Canadian is living in Japan, it's still counted as the GNP of Canada because nationality matters, but location does not. But if we talk about, for example, a Japanese living in Canada, that Japanese productivity is not counted as the GNP because the Japanese is not a Canadian. Now, GDP is different. GDP is not about nationality. is to measure the value of all the goods and services produced by a national economy within a given period with domestic factors of production. In other words, location matters. It doesn't matter whether a person is a Japanese, a Korean, as long as the person is living in Canada, is counted as the GDP of Canada. On the other hand, if a Canadian is now living and working in Singapore, that is not counted as the GDP. I wonder if there's any question so far?
No, sir.
Okay, so when we say that, for example, China is the second largest economy in the world, is it fair to say that the people in China are richer than the people in Canada?
No, sir.
Why?
Because it depends on GDP per capita.
Exactly. Because if we only talk about the GDP, we ignore the population, which is very important. In order to compare the living standard, the income of people in different countries, we cannot just look at the GDP. Otherwise, the country with a large population tends to have higher GDP. So we use an indicator. It's called GDP per capita. Per capita means per person. So you divide the GDP by the number of people in that country. Now, when you take your midterm test, don't be surprised to see such a question. With the GDP given, with the population given, and to calculate the GDP per capita. Now, GDP or GNP, they have limitations. For example, the measurement only talks about transactions that happen in the market. Because of that, the contribution of a housewife, the contribution of a grandma, because it's not a counted transaction, therefore it's not counted as part of the GDP. Underground economic activities, including illegal activities, are also not counted. Not that we don't want to include them, but we don't know exactly what are the values because they are underground, they are illegal, right? There's no way we can measure it very accurately. And also, if we look at the GDP or GDP per capita, we are talking about what is happening now. We can also look at the history, but we cannot accurately project the future. GDP per capita also does not illustrate income disparity. We may be talking about a country with a relatively high GDP per capita, meaning on average, the GDP per person may be high, but the reality is only a small percent of the population is getting most of the income. In that case, GDP per capita cannot illustrate it. It also does not consider the purchasing power of different countries. So these are some of the limitations regarding GDP or GNP. Now, GDP tends to be more commonly used. My guess is GDP is talking about what are happening in a country versus GNP is about people with the same nationality living in different parts of the world. So it's easier for the government to collect data regarding GDP. That's probably why it is more commonly used. In order to compare among countries, one way to do it is to put into consideration of the purchasing power in different countries. The relative ability of two countries' currencies to buy the same basket of goods in those countries, we called it purchasing power parity. So sometimes when people want to compare the economic condition between two countries, they do not only look at the GDP, they do not only look at the GDP per capita, but they also put into consideration of the purchasing power parity. Now, GDP is only one way to measure the economic development of a country. For example, the United Nations Human Development Index, they look at the long and healthy life, the education level, and a decent standard of living in order to assess the economic development of a country. So as you can see, a lot of the, for example, European countries, Canada, United States, they actually have the relatively high score regarding the Human Development Index. Now, economic transition, okay, we're talking about some countries, in order to fully utilize their potential, they try to do something to improve their economic performance and productivity. There was a time a number of countries adopted the centrally planned economic systems, but turned out to be a disaster. Because of that, ever since 1980s, 1990s, a lot of countries began to embrace the more market-oriented system. When they tried to change their system to the more market-oriented system, basically they try to allow private businesses to take up a more important role to determine the production. They allow prices to reflect supply and demand of products and services. Very often, governments need to reduce their deficits and to expand the credit availability in order businesses to borrow money easier. And also, a lot of those countries try to reduce barriers to trade and investment and allow currency to be converted more easily. A lot of those centrally planned economies, when trying to change to the more market-oriented economies, they are facing certain obstacles, including that they tend to be short of capital. They are short of people who know how to manage businesses. They still have a very strong tradition of centrally planned economy, and a lot of those government officials, they are against reforms. Also, they don't know how to develop the economy in a sustainable way. Very often, the economic system can be too fragile to embrace changes. Russia used to be adopting the centrally planned economy. In the 1980s, the former Soviet Union entered a new period of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and economic restructuring. They move away from the central planning system. However, Russia has been facing many challenges because of the relatively underdeveloped legal system. Corruption is a major concern. And also, they are short of talented managers. Their relationship with US and EU is fragile. Now, especially because of the war against Ukraine, now Russia has a very poor relationship with Europe and the Western world. Now, China is another example. They used to be facing major economic challenges. And in 1979, the economy was so poor. Because of that, they started to switch from the central planning economy to the market-oriented economy. The Chinese government actually describes it as socialism with Chinese characteristics. They are facing challenges, including the political system, a lack of checks and balances, the legal system, lack of human rights protection, although it is gradually improving, but there's still a lot of room for them to do a better job. Income disparity. Now, for the past few years, their relationship with US has deteriorated. And those are some of the challenges now China is facing. Now, for this week, based on what we have talked about just now, I want you to spend time to study a very interesting country. This country is Vietnam. Now, Vietnam used to be running the centrally planned system. Now, if you look at the history, Vietnam used to fight against United States for a number of years. It was a time when Vietnam was still not unified. And there was a North Vietnam and South Vietnam. United States was supporting the South Vietnam. So they had a civil war with the US heavily involved for a number of years. But now, if you look at Vietnam, not only that, the country is gradually giving up the centrally planned system, but it's also having a good relationship with United States. So this learning activity, oh, actually, you know what? I've got to change it. It should be learning activity 2, okay? Not 4. This learning activity is to ask you to find out, has Vietnam successfully transitioned from a centrally planned economy to a market one? Okay, that is the first question. The second question, is Vietnam a developing country, a newly developed, sorry, it should be a newly industrialized country, okay? A newly industrialized country, an emerging market, or a developed country. Out of the 4 options, pick one and explain to me why. In your view, what are the most important aspects of the economic growth of Vietnam today? Give 2 recent examples within the last year. When I say within the last year, I mean within year 2023 to help support your points. Because this learning activity involves research, so I expect citations and references should be included. Now, I wonder if there's any question so far.
No, sir.
No? Okay. So you know what? I'm going to post the learning activity as well as the PowerPoint file. So you should be able to see them when reading the important announcement. If you want to watch the video of today's class, I will also include a YouTube link so that you may watch the video again if you want to.
Okay, Professor.
Now, the last thing I want to remind you is I asked you to form a team of 6 to 8 people. Now, if you haven't done it, make sure you do it. And I guess you can give me the list next Monday. Or you can send me an email this week to share with me the names of your team members. But the latest day to do it will be next Monday. Okay, I
Yes, sir.
wonder if there's any question.
No, Professor.
No? Okay. That's it for today. If you have anything that you want to talk to me, feel free to stay behind. Otherwise, happy Thanksgiving.
You too, Professor.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
Yes, you too.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye, Avneet.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Happy Thanksgiving.
Same to you, Professor.